So talking about this Starfield stuff has really opened up a lot of opportunity to be able to share a lot of what game development is about. I like having the conversation. The only problem is a lot of people get combative when you start to show the technical side of it. I'm not here to throw anybody under the bus. I'm here to just share the knowledge that is quite available for anybody to be able to find anyways, to give a better understanding as to why some of these games are not running at 60 FPS. Some developers have talked about, visual fidelity. In fact, there was another developer who actually added some insight today. I thought their point of view was quite interesting. They have, experience with about 20, AAA games that they've shipped out, or 20 games anyways. I don't know if they said 20 AAA games, but they're a veteran AAA developer. They worked on, GTA 5, Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, and so on and so forth. And it gives some really interesting insights overall about this whole conversation. Some of them are technical. They even talk about even production, which is really cool. We'll look at all that in this video today because a lot of my suspicions, I think, are being confirmed. Now, whenever we're talking about a game at 60 FPS versus a game at 30 FPS, I'd like for everybody to acknowledge the scope of those games. A game that is running in front of you and another game are designed differently. That's basically scope. No one expects a Starfield in the way and the scope that it's being designed without a target of 60 FPS from the day they started making the game. No one expects that game is going to run like that. So what's been happening is what this developer confirms in his 17-point rant on Twitter. I recommend that you go read everything. I'm not going to read everything because he says something here that I thought was very interesting. It caught my ear. He said a game being being limited to 30 or 60 or whatever is by design, not some accident. A lot of people say it's because the devs are lazy, or it's because the devs don't know what they're doing, or it's because the devs are incompetent, or because they're inexperienced. That's not true. The 30 FPS choice was made deliberately before production started, almost certainly. And by the way, this developer hates 30 FPS games. In his rant, he makes it very well known that he hates it. He can't stand it. He does not play 30 FPS games, doesn't play on console, doesn't care either way, but is just dropping his knowledge. He says, my point still stands. Nothing I've read changes my mind so far. CPU or GPU bottleneck being the cause is weeds. He doesn't even fall for the GPU and CPU bottleneck. I've always maintained that if you want to get the game to run at 60 FPS, you have to make major changes. Some people think that it's by the way the game looks, because the game looks like a movie in one regard, and another game doesn't look like a movie. Hence, the other game that doesn't look like a movie or a high graphics cartoon needs to run at 60 FPS, but that's not how it works. The scope of a game like Marvel's Spider-Man and Miles Morales is a single player game. You have your specific buildings where you can actually go into some of them, and you can't necessarily react to the world as much as you do with some other games. And so the scope is actually very well defined. The game does not go out of bounds to do anything that it's not here to do. It's not having you swing over water, huge bodies of water. No, you're within the limits of the city. It's not till Spider-Man 2 that we're going to see the water action. We don't know how that's going to look, but it'll be interesting to see. So they've basically kept the game in a place where they know the game is going to be limited and you can actually leverage the full machine, which is your PS5 and your Series X. I also see some people making the fallacy of the machine comparison, which is something that you should not do. They say, well, the console equivalents, the PC equivalents of the console are doing 60 FPS. Why is the PC not doing 60? Why is the console not doing 60 FPS? Well, this developer already said that they start from ground up making the game to be either 30 or 60 FPS. So it's not like the console can't do 60 FPS in most games. You just have to design the console version to do 60 FPS. Number two, when your consoles tell you that we have an 8-core CPU, they have an 8-core CPU, but it's not the same as a 6-core CPU in many cases for a desktop. So I'll give you an example. There are 8-core CPUs, and then there are really good 8-core CPUs. There's this 5800X3D, which is an AMD CPU. Let me go ahead and do this here. This CPU is a very coveted CPU. There's also a big brother for it, and it's a very interesting CPU. It can give you some really good frames, but ladies and gentlemen, this CPU, brand new right now, is at $289.27. On Amazon, they're selling it $289.06. That's basically like 80% of the cost of your entire console if you get a good deal on a console. If if you're buying it for $300, $399, I guess. Maybe it's not 80%, but it's a huge percentage. Let me not throw stupid math out there because I suck at math, right? And so this game is basically defined. Now, when the bosses, according to this developer, he says, according to his analysis, he thinks that the studio executives are the ones making the decisions not to offer 144060, which has similar GPU draw perf as 216030. But he also admits, though, that it depends on the CPU time required. But he says it comes from the top. So when your boss says, we need to make a Spider-Man game that runs at 60 FPS, and you say, sure, but we're going to have to redesign the game. He says, sure, no problem, make a remastered. Because they could have easily unlocked the 30 FPS 2018 version, but it's not designed to target the 33 millisecond frame time, which is something that this developer cites at the beginning of his tweets. He basically gives the formula. Remember, I gave this formula in my video yesterday. A lot of folk were looking at it like, what is he talking about? But you have to know this. It's not about ray tracing or resolution or whatever. It's about the entirety of the game running at this frame persistence. So when you build your first level and you start testing it, you start making changes and modifications to get this frame time so that you can achieve 60 FPS. Then you move on to the next part of your building. If you're not building the game like that from ground up, you're not going to be able to easily target or achieve 60 FPS unless you're fortunate for the machine to be much more stronger when you deliver the game. This is what's happened with a lot of other games, whereby when the new consoles came out, they were like, oh yeah, this game can run a 60 FPS because it was running on 30 FPS on a super duper potato old console. That's pretty much what happened in those cases. So they would have had to make the deliberate decision to start from ground up. So when your boss says to you, hey man, we're going to develop a superhero game that has co-op, a superhero game where it's open world, you can run around with your friends. Yeah. Oh, okay, you know what? Let there be loot in the game. Oh, yeah. Hey, you know what? Let there be different characters in the game. So the more they start to add the scope to the game, you're going, boss, this is going to be a really, really heavy game to make, and it's probably not going to be able to reach this frame time. Plus, you even started development of the game on the PS4, which already everybody was developing at that point at 33 milliseconds. Well, what you have is a game like Gotham Knights. More complex, a game that has so many more systems and so many more elements that a game like Marvel's Spider-Man does not even dream to have. Yes, I said it. A game like Marvel's Spider-Man is not as complex in its development and design as a game like Gotham Knights. Just because they use a photorealistic look in the Spider-Man games, it looks good. It doesn't seem to be as complex from any measure in my mind. And I'm sure we can take this argument to a developer and put money on it. You want to put money on it? I'm not a betting man. I suck. Whenever I bet on chance, I lose every single time. But I'll throw a bet out there with you. We'll do a $100 gift card. If you want to take me up on it, first person to comment, I'm down with it. Let's put the bet on the table. Let's put our money where our mouth is. Let me give you a few examples as to why I think this is the case as well with the scope of the game also causing these issues when they don't target that this game should run at this frame time. A game like Gotham Knights, in some crazy, world, has to have all these dependencies. An example, and for the sake of time, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do it in this video. So, if you're going to keep watching, by all means, keep going. An enemy class called the Mob. This is the enemy class that Robin is fighting over here. They have a weakness. Their weakness is bioelectricity. Whenever you're designing a game like this, you can do it in many different ways. You can create a parent class. That's basically one big class called the Mob, blueprint base or blueprint actor, the main class, and then create some other minions from that class. So in the main class, you're going to give everybody specific attributes. And one of those attributes would probably be, if you get shocked, behave like this, lose this much health, and all that stuff. Then everybody else would eventually start getting differences. So this big lady here, she's going to have more health. She's going to have her own animations and stuff. And then all of those classes now have to listen to every bioelectric signal that they get. So if Robin hits you a bioelectric from his weapon, you got to behave like this based on Robin's gear, based on the power level of his gear, based on the level of the enemy that you are. All of these different things are all talking to one another as the game is firing. And then the AI is also running its logic saying, oh, I'm going to punch Robin. Or if it's Batgirl, I'm going to shoot Batgirl. Or if it's Red Hood. And all of these different dependencies are speaking to one another. So when the developer is working on, taking notes from the boss, they're cringing every time the boss is saying, oh, and it needs to be an RPG. And you're like, oh my God, an RPG? Whereas depending on your relationship with your boss, you can say, well, I think we're going to go for an action adventure game. And your boss is like, really? Do you think that's a good idea? And you're like, yeah, we're going to do an action adventure game. And we think it's going to be really cool. We're going to work on other things like our swing mechanics. We're going to make sure it is very smooth and beautiful. And traversal is 100% great. And the other team is going, oh my gosh, we got to work on traversal for 4 different characters. So the scope and the design of the game is a big deal. So when I'm sure Tom Howard said to his team, we're going to make a game with 1,000 planets, I guarantee you a bunch of people were like, oh my gosh, that's insane. So when we think about this conversation, it comes down to one thing that this developer finalizes. And I think, his thoughts had a lot of personal anecdotes. There are some things that he didn't necessarily like in the bureaucracy of game development and how game developers sometimes will look down on gamers and how gamers can be toxic. He says all that stuff here. But something he says about this, he says, if 30p bothers you, then you need to go ahead and buy yourself a PC. He says, stop buying consoles. That's his number 17. I told you guys it was a 17, point rant. He says, to conclude, 30 FPS is garbage. This is a developer. He says it. It's known video games shouldn't be slideshows. Even 60 is too low. And he says, at the end of the day, he says, I encourage gamers to vote with their dollar bills. Stop buying consoles if 30p bugs you. The only thing the studio heads will listen to is basically dollars. I've been saying this for a long time. I've been suspicious about these consoles. I've also been saying about the, studio executives and how different studios have different, circumstances within which they work under. Sony largely needs these games to be 60 FPS. Their business model is based on all of that. Microsoft, it doesn't seem like it is, but it seems because Sony is setting the tone in the market, everybody else is now going to maybe be responding. But here are the ramifications of what that means. Because these consoles are limited in their scope, their CPU design, their GPU design, even though they may have console equivalencies, those equivalencies are eventually going to become redundant. So what these developers might eventually start doing is cutting down the scope of the games to accommodate the consoles. If that's the implication that I'm seeing, and that's my own thought process, because 1,000 planets on a console, I mean, we're not going to be looking at 60 millisecond frame time with everything that the game is going to have in terms of all of the code, your inventory, the way the NPCs behave, and record and remember conversations that you have or choices that you made or all these things, right? This is all work being done by the CPU, and that's not even going into the GPU where it's actually displaying a lot of the logic in terms of textures and so on and so forth. So if that's the case, we're probably not going to be getting ambitious games until we get new consoles that are capable of actually, truly pushing the limits of hardware design being made portable. But until then, we're just going to live with the marketing that's been sold to us. And I know someone's going to cite ray tracing and all this stuff. And someone told me that ray tracing drops FPS. Of course it does. You're doing heavy calculations on the game. But if you have a really good CPU, ray tracing is not necessarily going to hit you as much as a crappy CPU will. A 5800X 3D 8-core is going to do a better job with ray tracing than a PS5's 8-core CPU. That is just a scientific reality because their design and the way they behave actually allows for the advantage to be on that particular much more sophisticated CPU. It's just a reality. And so, again, I think scope of the game is actually a very big deal. And for those who keep saying that Gotham Knights can run at 60 FPS, not in the way that it is, it'd have to change a lot of things to run at 60 FPS. In fact, one way for it to run at 60 FPS is to make it like The Division. The Division runs basically almost everything on the server side. Your open world, your player, and all that stuff is run on your machine. But if this game is offline, you can't play the game. If you don't have an internet connection, you can't play the game. But Gotham Knights, you can play the game without an internet connection. That should tell you that there is a difference in design. Because a lot of what Gotham Knights is doing, it's doing a lot of those processes locally and still having the ability to connect. And your boss told you that all your friends can join you. Your friend can join you and go anywhere in the open world that they want to go. Like, that's not going to cost any more CPU and GPU, power and RAM, costs. Like, yeah, they can just ride their bat cycle. Elden Ring didn't even dare do it. Elden Ring does not give you untethered, co-op. It wouldn't even do it in the same region. It would do it in areas in specific places, and you don't even get your horse anymore. Once you co-op in Elden Ring, you don't get a horse. You guys have got to leg it. But your boss in Gotham, your Gotham Knights boss said, hey, man, and let everybody get a bat cycle too. And people tell me, or, I mean, if we wanted to logically break it down, people will claim that Spider-Man can do 60 FPS, yet Gotham Knights can't. And they say Gotham Knights should be able to do 60 FPS. Not in the current way that it is. They'd have to redesign a lot of different systems in the game. They'd have to go back and actually tweak more than textures. They'd have to change the way the dependencies work from a code base. So basically, in my opinion, I think they'd have to redesign huge elements of the game to be able to get it to scale down to work on these console machines. The CPU, requirements on, PCs, on the PC desktop CPUs, and the way that those function are able to get the job done this is just my off the hand thinking, right? But anyways, I've spent about 15 minutes on this video. I'm going to get out of here. So let me hear your thoughts in the comment section. Talk to me. Peace out.